is Adelaide. I'm the manager of leadership development programs here at Creative Australia. I would love to extend my deep respect to the elders of the country that I'm on today. I'm on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Warrane in Sydney, where the Creative Australia offices are. And thank the elders of this country for their deep and abiding care for this place over generations and in the ways in which they continue to care for country. I'm really pleased to welcome you all today to the third in our Governance Conversation series webinars. This series is part of our overall governance program, which is designed to support best practice in governance in the arts and cultural industries. We have a range of different programs as part of or initiatives as part of the governance program. So we offer training in partnership with the Australian Institute for Company Directors. And we also will be soon releasing a series of resources and case studies on various different aspects of best practice in governance. This Governance Conversation series, we are very pleased to partner with Diversity Arts Australia to have conversations about some of the critical and contemporary issues in governance, and to think about what are the boards that we need, what are the governance structures that we need that will serve us, that will enable greater diversity and inclusion, will enable the organisations that to thrive, and will enable us to serve our communities better. Really wanted to extend my thanks to Lena Nahlous, Director of Diversity Arts Australia, and also to Gurkum Agorkuru, who is our producer for this series. Really appreciate your time and your collegiality in developing this series. And with that, I'll pass over to you, Lena. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adelaide, and welcome everyone. I'd also like to respectfully acknowledge the First Peoples of these lands and the various lands we're all zooming in from, and to acknowledge First Peoples' ongoing connections to sky, sea and land, and the rich diversity of First Nations cultures, languages and communities. I'm joining from the unceded lands of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my deepest respects to elders past and present and all First Nations folks joining us today. Thanks for attending today's third governance conversation, succession planning, who are the board members of the future. My name, as Adelaide mentioned, is Lena Nahlous, and I'm the CEO of Diversity Arts Australia and the host of these conversations. I'm a middle-aged Arab woman. I have light olive skin, dark brown hair with some grey, and I'm wearing black rim glasses and a blue speckled top. Diversity Arts is the national voice for ethnocultural and migrant racial equity in the creative sectors. We work a lot in partnership with First Nations and disability organisations, and we're really proud to be co-hosting these sessions with the newly formed Creative Australia. Today, we're joined by two incredible speakers with such great knowledge and experience, and I'm so pleased to welcome Clothilde, also known as Clo Bullen, and Caroline Bowditch, who I'll introduce shortly after a little bit of housekeeping. So the main way that you can contribute to today is via the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We'll try, if we can, to answer your questions throughout and where possible, in writing if we can, or at the conversation at the end if we have time. The session is being recorded and it will be shared to the Creative Australia website page next week, and we can send you more info about a link to that page. You can also catch up on the other conversations and encourage your colleagues to kind of catch up on them as well. I'd like to also introduce our Auslan interpreters, Jody Bibiana and Marnie Wood. The session is also being live captioned, and you can turn on the live captions in the Zoom window by toggling on off the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can also change the size of the text in the subtitle settings or pop out a window to view the full transcript. So today's session is scheduled to run for 90 minutes. And we're going to talk about the importance of embedding equity principles into succession planning and how organisations can broaden their recruitment beyond established sector networks. And we'll also delve into the process of appointing new board members and identifying future leaders. We have 2 fantastic case studies, youth arts case studies to show you as well. So to ensure a productive and respectful discussion, we ask you to please adhere to the following values in the way that you participate in the session: to act respectfully, professionally, and engage genuinely in the discussion, to practice deep listening and remain open to other perspectives, to avoid passing judgment, and to collaborate in creating a safe space for everyone involved. And we know we can never guarantee safe spaces, but we ask you to work towards making this a safe space. If you find the discussions challenging or stressful at any point, please feel free to take a break and return when you're ready, because your well-being is very important. So now I'd like to introduce our first guest, Clothilde Bullen, to talk about her relationship and experience with governance structures. Now, I should mention both of our speakers have pretty illustrious kind of CVs and bios, and I could probably take a whole 90 minutes kind of exploring them. So this is a very abbreviated version. Clo Bullen is a Wadandi and Buddy Maya First Nations Senior Curator. Clo is currently Senior Curator and Head of Indigenous Programs at the Art Gallery of Western Australia. Prior to this, she was the Senior Curator of First Nations Art at Sydney's Museum of Contemporary Art for 4 years, and a decade previously was at the Art Gallery of Western Australia. Clo is co-chair of Indigenous Voices, board member of the International Association of Art Critics Australia, and board member of NAVA, National Association for the Visual Arts. So welcome, Clo, and over to you.
Hello. Thank you,
Hello.
Lena, very much. So as Lena has mentioned, I'm actually off country. I live and work off country on Wadjuk country, which is, of course, living and working in Boorloo, Perth. But my countries are further southwest, so down towards sort of Bunbury and Collie and Margaret River and Busselton in the southwest of Western Australia. That's the Wadandi Nation, and that's where my bloodlines are from. And I'm also Buddy Maya, which is the Yamatji Nation. So I've got a bit of an Aboriginal passport across multiple spaces. It's really important for me to acknowledge that it's a lens through which I speak about my curatorial practice, but also will be the lens that I'm speaking through when I talk about governance and succession planning and things like that. And really specifically, I am the chair of the National Association for the Visual Arts Board. I have been for the last sort of 3.5 years, and it's also through that lens that I'm speaking as well, because it certainly taught me a lot about being the chair of that board. I've been on many, many boards previously and are on a few still now, but it certainly helped me to really frame how I feel about succession planning, particularly for boards and governance. So it's really through those 2 lenses that I'm going to sort of speak today. I wanted to pose a couple of things before we start and before Caroline and I sort of start getting into conversation. I want to introduce the idea about succession planning and particularly when it comes to governance and being on boards, but also just in general, that succession planning can look quite different in First Nations communities. And that idea is really critical to the way I'm going to be speaking for the rest of this conversation. So I really wanted to kind of mention why it's different and why I'm kind of using that lens, I guess. When we talk about succession planning in general, particularly when we're talking about it in our sort of daily work lives, we might be thinking about this idea that you know, one of the bosses is leaving and they need to find another boss to kind of step into their position, and they may have identified someone or a group of people, and they bring them into that space to take over. Perhaps they do a bit of a handover, they train them beforehand, who knows. When we talk about succession planning, we often, and I say we as First Nations people, we often talk about it not even just related to employment opportunities or to boards or any of that, but often when it comes to intergenerational transmission of knowledge. And that often takes a community focus rather than an individual focus. And so when we talk about succession planning, we're talking about how do we hand down those knowledges from our elders, and we always acknowledge elders in our acknowledgements or welcome to countries. It's elders who undertake that work. They are the bodies of cultural knowledge that really underpin our nations. So succession planning might look like, how do we receive, how do those people transmit, and how do we receive cultural knowledge from those people in order to facilitate the cultural work that we do in our workplaces and in our everyday lives. So in that sense, it's really broad, and you could be looking at a community focus rather than an individual kind of thing. So that's quite different. And so when I'm talking about succession planning, I'm talking about how, you know, and I'm thinking about it, and we'll get into this later, but I'm thinking about, all right, I might identify some younger people, some individuals who we could train to become involved in a board or train to step into a role that I might want to leave, but I'm not going to do that individually. I'm going to think about the community and how many people we might be able to sort of bring on board to do that with, because we always need more than one person. And I think about, all right, so how does that benefit the community? How do we embed some of the learning that we're sort of, you know, giving to these individuals? How do we embed that across the community? So it's a very different idea. And finally, just before I hand over, just focusing on that sort of intergenerational transmission, succession planning doesn't always have to be, you know, it's often an older and more experienced person that are kind of planning to bring someone else in. But succession planning can also happen between people who have different facets or components of knowledge. And they don't have to be older or younger. They can be more experienced in certain areas. But what we really are hoping that we do is kind of make it a more equitable space where there's not just a downward sort of transmission of power, but also an upward one. So two-way learning, if you want to think of it that way. So that's all I have to say about sort of the lens that I'm coming through, but hopefully we can get into a good conversation, and I'm really looking forward to it.
Thanks so much, Chloe. That was fantastic. I like that kind of concept of, you know, two-way learning, and also that the way of thinking about it is more thinking about community rather than just individual succession planning. So that, it seems from my perspective, a much more equitable kind of way of thinking about succession planning and the way that we work. I'd now like to introduce our second speaker, who Diversity Arts has worked with closely since 2018 on the Fair Play program. Carolyn Bowditch is the Chief Executive Officer and Artistic Director of Arts Access Victoria. Prior to this, Carolyn enjoyed an acclaimed career in the UK for over 16 years as a performance maker and an industry leader. Carolyn's strong advocacy has resulted in significant reform for funding programs for deaf and disabled artists locally, and she's overseen the development of a new strategic plan at Arts Access Victoria and led the organisation through a successful transition to hybrid delivery through the COVID-19 pandemic. And as I said with Chloe, there's just so much with Carolyn, and those of you who know her will, you know, can attest to this. So Carolyn, please forgive me for that very brief introduction. Now over to you, because I know there's so much more.
Thanks, Lena. Hi, everyone. I am coming to you from Meanjin or Brisbane today. I usually live and work on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung lands or Boonwurrung lands in Naarm or Melbourne. But it's a privilege to be up in hot and sunny Brisbane at the moment on these beautiful lands. And I pay my respects to elders from these lands that I am less familiar with and but have been made to feel very welcome on. And last night I had the privilege of being at the opening of the Undercover Artist Festival, which is, for those of you that don't know, is a disability arts festival that happens up here every 2 years. So it's the alternate year to Alter State, which we have in Victoria, and Arts Access Victoria is a partner with Arts Centre Melbourne on delivering Alter State. And last night there was a beautiful Welcome to Country that was performed by a deaf First Nations group, and it was just extraordinary. It was an extraordinary way to be welcomed through bodies and not necessarily through words that we're so familiar with. So that was a beautiful thing. So a bit like Chloe, I come to you with a very strong disability lens. It is the thing that shapes my world. As a very proud disabled person, I'm a wheelchair user, so my disability is very obvious to the world. I often joke about the fact that I try to pretend that it's not there, but it just never goes away. Much harder to do when you're attached to a massive piece of equipment. But we also, I want to acknowledge all the disabled leaders that I very much ride on the path of, that have carved that path out for me previously and have allowed me to have the privileged role of being the CEO at Arts Access Victoria. But also it was a significant person in Veronica Pardo that actually was a major part of my journey into this role 5.5 years ago now. And it was Veronica working with the board at AAV that really acknowledged that as a disability arts organisation, it needed to be led by a disabled person. And we talk a lot about in leadership about people needing to step aside, and that was exactly what Veronica did. She acknowledged that she needed to step aside to create space for a disabled person to lead the organisation, and I've been lucky enough to be the custodian, is a word that's been introduced to me recently, of the organisation for the last 5.5 years, and we've done a lot in that time. And I think what I have noticed or observed in the process of us writing our most recent strategic plan, we're really reflecting on what change has happened by having disability leadership. And what we really noticed was that the conversations are different. By me being around the table or involved in conversations as a CEO, in a leadership role, what has happened is that we've stopped talking about disability in those conversations, or the disability community as an anthropological group that we service or we think about when we're doing our disability equity plans or whatever it might be. But actually I'm very present in that conversation, and so the conversation changes and allows us to head in different directions. So we are in the process of changing chairs on our board. So another big thing that's happened is that our board is now made up of 75% of people who identify as having disability in some way, shape or form, whether that's obvious or hidden. But it's we can very proudly say that we are disability led at board level, in that we have a disabled chair in the fabulous Amanda Laurie Jones, but Amanda is stepping down. So we're in the process of we have 2 vice chairs throughout this year, who will take over from Amanda towards the end of this year, but have had a year to be in that vice chair role, and they will then take over, one as chair and one as vice chair, continuing forward. So we've been thinking about it the whole time, which has been really important. Yeah, I could talk more. We've got a youth advisory group. I'm sure that will come up through the conversation, which I think is also a really interesting thing to think about, because our young people in the world aren't necessarily taught about disability history, about disability politics. Some of them are very much living it, but we've established a youth advisory committee this year that we are very much learning from, and we have one of our board members chairs, who is a young person, chairs the youth advisory committee and is able to be the conduit between that group of 8 young people and the board, so that the information flows from one to the other, which is that was a new thing for us, and it's something that we're learning from and refining as we go along. But we absolutely acknowledge the importance of us building the pride and I suppose the disability knowledge within those young people to to feel confident to represent the politics that sit around disability, so that there can be not just tokenistic involvement or box ticking, but also that there can be a really enriching and nuanced conversation around some of the issues that emerge, from a disability perspective. I'm going to hand back to Lena, because I'm sure other things will emerge as we talk.
Yes, I'm already thinking I can't wait to hear more about your youth advisory committee. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And I really resonated with your point about how the conversation really changes when people with lived experience are leading the organisation and, leading the process of the strategic planning, and the importance of, people being in the organisations who actually are members of the communities they seek to represent. So great news about your board comprising 75% of disabled people. So I am going to, the first topic that we're going to be exploring is effective succession planning for leadership roles. And we've already touched on that, I think, with both Carolyn and Chloe. I might go to you, Chloe, to ask, what are some of the essential prerequisites for successfully implementing succession planning in different contexts? And you've already, I think, given us a pretty good grounding for this question in terms of the approach that that you take and First Nations organisations often take. But can I throw this question to you, Chloe?
Yeah, absolutely. And I too really actually loved your comment, Caroline, about, being at the table. Being at the table is unbelievably important, because it's not the issues and the things that go with that. They're not seen as like at arm's length. You're right there and it can't be ignored. And so I think that is absolutely critical, but we're talking about the precursor to that. So I'll go back. So a few things really, and I will draw on the NAVA kind of board experience for me, because there are so many things that NAVA is actually getting really, really right, and I'm actually really proud to be the chair of that board. One of the things that I've spoken at great length about to Penelope, who's the executive, the CEO, the executive director, of NAVA is really about having some frameworks and structures in place if you do want First Nations people to be employed or to be on the board, that sort of need to happen before you do that to make it culturally safe. And Lena, you talked about cultural safety at the beginning and kind of setting out a bit of a pathway or a framework for this talk. The same thing needs to happen with organisations who are predominantly non-First Nations, to actually have a bit of a framework to work towards. So I would suggest, and this is what I've seen kind of work, that you have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy, and that policy speaks to the way that you work with communities, the way that you employ people, the way that you go about your business, you know, like day to day, the way, you know, all of those sorts of things. So policy is really handy, and a lot of it, I personally, I nerd out on policy, so I actually love policy, and I think it does a thing. And the thing it does is it gives people a really clear kind of structure for what they're working in. Now, that doesn't mean it's perfect, and it always needs to be reviewed and worked on. But if you have an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy, you at least have this is the playing field. This is what we're working under. So I think that's really critical. And good organisations, when I was working at the Museum of Contemporary Art, we had an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy. We had there, and NAVA is also working towards it, and many other places are working towards it, is a really good and really a functional Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander advisory board or committee, however that is structured. And I would suggest going even further than that, and sort of not just pulling on the same people everyone always pulls on, but actually looking at the selection criteria for those boards about what you need, and then getting people to fit with that. So instead of just going, oh, I know that one Aboriginal person, I'll call on them again. So I think that's really critical as a bit of a precursor as well, because if you want to have First Nations people employed in your organisation, they need a separate advisory group to go to when things get tough, and it will in any organisation. So they need that mechanism to go to, as opposed to going to, you know, a non-Indigenous HR manager who might not understand some of the issues. So that's really critical as well. And the other thing that I would suggest, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, is to cluster hire. And we're going to address that later, but don't just have one Aboriginal person in your organisation or your board. Actually have multiple people, because there's a lot more cultural safety that actually can occur when that happens. So these are some of the precursors, I think, for me, that I've seen work that are helpful. Another thing that's super helpful is the level of kind of cultural competency work that staff in an organisation have done. And you can, there are lots and lots of places around that do this kind of work and that offer these kinds of workshops, and you do an evaluation, and it's a bit of a litmus test for where people are sitting, because you can't expect non-First Nations people to come to the party and understand all that you're trying to achieve without also bringing them with you and bringing them on board and getting them to understand the importance of that. So that's also sort of a critical component, and these things should be kind of planned out, I think, in a very particular way.
Thank you, Chloe. That was actually such practical and really implementable, you know, advice. I think, you know, setting up those things in advance of people coming into the organisation, things like First Nations advisory committees, making sure people have got the training and the knowledge to be able to be on board with the vision of First Nations workers, cluster hiring. It's really exciting stuff. And
None of it's easy.
No, none of it's easy, but it's...
They all seem like, yes, you just do these 4 things, but actually each thing is really hard.
And also they take time, and we're always being told that we need to rush everything, and then big mistakes happen, and it's just not worth it. And I feel like in our sector, we need to push back against the push for us to have to rush everything, because that's when I know that we've made our biggest mistakes, is when we've been pushed, whether it be because of funding priorities or whatever it might be, to rush and not take the time that we need to do this right, develop these partnerships or whatever it might be, develop that foundational work. And I wondered, Carolyn, does that also resonate with you in terms of the disability space in the arts that you're working in?
Yeah, I mean, Chloe's point about choosing the right person with the skills that you actually need for a board rather than just some random disabled person. It's like, you'll do, come on in. But actually acknowledging the skills that someone brings and actively seeking them. And there are absolutely ways to do that. Before anyone joins our board, I send them a massive pack of information about stuff that they need to know, not just about the organisation, but absolutely to increase their disability literacy in a way so that they can, I suppose it feels similar to competency, but actually a lot of it is just about skilling people up to be able to have the conversations that we might be having, to give them the background around I suppose the state of play and the politics that are sitting around disability arts, particularly for us at the time, and they continue to be things that we discuss at board level as well. So yeah, not choosing random people, and yeah, making sure that they have a level of disability literacy that allows those conversations to be rich and useful.
And I think you've kind of more or less answered the question I was going to ask you, which was about if, you know, like what should a board possess prior to bringing in? So say you have an organization that doesn't have any, so I'll just ask you it this way. So you have an organization that currently doesn't have any disabled board members, and they want to change that and bring in board members who are disabled. So Carolyn, what would you say to them that they need to do in order to set things up so that when those new board members come in, the organisation's going to be welcoming and that's going to be a good experience for everyone?
I suppose the first thing, there's obviously a whole conversation we could have around cultural safety from a disability perspective that often we don't have. We often don't think about disability as a culture. We think about it as a thing. But there is a culture that sits around disability. There is a massive culture that sits around the deaf community. And there's something about it's the education around the disability politics, I suppose, in this country. There's also the very basic thing about what someone needs in terms of access. So, for example, our board meetings are always have we have a deaf board member, so they're always Auslan interpreted. We have live captioning, and we also need to do audio description for anything that we are presenting. So that all happens, and it all happens with also with crip time in mind. So we're always thinking about how do people need to take breaks to be able to stay engaged in the conversation. But there's an amazing group called Voice at the Table that is based in Melbourne, but there might be offices in other places. But their whole purpose is that they work with disabled people to prepare them to be part of boards. So to give them governance skills so that they are able to then sit on boards and feel confident and comfortable to input, to share opinions, to share thoughts, to enrich a board. So I think major one is get educated about disability and what's alive at the moment in the country, and also just very basic around what people's access requirements might be in that space, and gear yourself up for the language and the kind of conversation around ableism, which is very active in our art sector and something that we don't necessarily talk about as much as we might need to.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. I just wrote some notes for myself. So I think that really, it's good to know about Voice at the Table, and we should pop that link in or share it with you via the via the Australia Council website, where we'll put these recordings. But I think what Chloe and you have both said about education and the need for education seems to be that is an absolute prerequisite, and all of those other important kind of things that you'd put in place so that people could genuinely be able to access those meetings fully as their full person, whether that be Auslan interpreting, live captioning, audio description, and like you said, keeping time in mind as well, having breaks. Chloe, I might ask you, and if you want to add to that question, maybe you can do that as part of this one. But this one is about more succession planning and what needs to be put in place for an organisation to be ready for effective succession planning as well. So there's a little bit of a crossover.
Yeah. Well, I really wanted to respond. I mean, when Caroline speaks, I always think of a billion things as you're talking. And one of the things that just really struck me then actually was that in my mind, I was going, how do we caption language, as in First Nations language? We have, over 300 languages in Australia. There are very few people outside of our own communities who know how to speak those languages. How would anyone be able to sign them if we spoke in language? How would we close caption that when we don't have, fluent non-Indigenous speakers of language? Like, in my mind, I was going, oh my God, like how I sort of hadn't clocked that, I guess, because so we in the Noongar community, the community I'm from, there's a lot of us that speak language, partially, fully, bits and pieces. So there's already boundaries around, or barriers around who is fluent, who's not. Expand that out to the rest of the continent. I've done work with artists who are a completely different language group to me, and I've had to learn language that's a First Nations language, but not my own. How do we make sense of that in terms of being able to give access? How do we, and I don't have any of those answers, because it was just like firing my brain off when you were talking about, oh my God, like, how would we do this? And, for me, the other thing about, so just an example, we had a board member from Maningrida actually on the MCA First Nations board. And it was fantastic because we did a lot of work with Maningrida, so we knew them pretty well, and we were sort of back and forth all the time. Maningrida, for those who don't know, is in Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory, quite sort of remote, I guess, community, 800 people, 15 different languages in that community. And so this particular community member who was a young person, first language was not English. But she was on our board. And what was really tricky about all of that was and I know this sounds really dumb and stupid, but it is so important to think about. If you're going to have remote community representation on boards, for the love of God, check the internet connections and how they can actually be in the room electronically with you. Because what we found was that there was no spaces in that community to actually do what we're doing now. I'm sitting with my back to my kitchen doing this at the moment, but there wasn't even those spaces available for people. The internet would constantly drop out. There were language barriers. There was all kinds of things that we were contending with and that they were contending with. So I think, having remote and regional First Nations community representation on boards is absolutely critical, but you need to first work out how to make that easy for everyone involved and how to make that access easy. So I think, that's what kind of calls to mind after after what you said, Caroline, like, how do we manage those components, I guess? Going back to succession planning, I mean, I think I probably covered quite a bit of that in sort of responding to the first question, but what I will say is that there is a different cultural understanding about timing, I guess, and what's important. So with a lot of First Nations mob, what's really important to us is, having our kids and our communities around, being with our families. We've got really important, funerals and things like that different sort of cultural rituals, I guess, that are super, super critical. They sometimes break into the timing of succession planning. And I know that certainly was the case for me. In our communities, there's, you know, like every community, there's single parents, there's people who have not been gifted with the level of financial stability that, you know, so many people are gifted with. All of those kind of really boring sort of practical concerns, particularly for blackfellas, has a massive impact on succession planning. Because if those things aren't stable, you can't keep someone mentored and trained and in that position to be able to take something on if, you know, if they're sort of dealing with all this other stuff. And I would imagine, Caroline, it's probably there are similar issues around disability as well. So I think, you know, the workplace, if that's what we're talking about, and we might be in this instance, can't sort of deal with all of those things necessarily, and don't and shouldn't necessarily have to, but sometimes have to. But that kind of facilitation and that care and that kind of understanding, dealing with First Nations issues. I mean, we're dealing with referendum stuff at the moment, for example. It is an unholy shit show, and I'm very happy to say that. What it's doing to my staff, what it's doing to other First Nations staff around the country, we need employees to understand that there is stuff that happens like this that makes it really difficult for us to remain in our roles, to, you know, we need time off to kind of deal with things. You know, I'm going to see a lot of First Nations people across the country take time off after, you know, October 16th, that week of. So it's things like this, I think there has to be, and part of this is about the education that you talked about, Caroline, like actually getting people to understand the context, I guess, around it.
Thanks so much, Chloe. That was a lot. That was a lot. Yeah. And I think for us, like at Diversity Arts, with some of that really resonated, I guess, in terms of language and also, I guess, when things blow up in particular ways, like, for example, when the you know, when there was a barrage of increased anti-Asian racism during COVID, that then directly impacted the people in the sector being able to do their jobs and so kind of having an understanding of that more broadly, and recognizing that was actually really critical to being able to kind of retain people and also support the artists and the people we work with. So anyway, there was a lot there. And I think we also talk about accent diversity because we're very aware that it's often people like me who are born here, who are in the roles that we're in, but there's an absolute need for there to be more recent migrants and people whose first language isn't English, and the fact that quite often the language of governance locks out those people whose first language might not be English, or for a range of reasons. So there was so much in there that I'm still processing. So
I know, sorry about that.
it's wonderful. No, it's awesome. It's actually because I feel like since I've been at Diversity Arts Australia, we've been looking at and learning from First Nations organisations and how they're going about their business, and realising that there's a lot for us to learn in that. And I would say similarly in working with Caroline as well, it's definitely been important for us. It's changed some of the way that we work and think about things and approach things. So and I think that it's applicable, I guess what I'm saying, across all organizations, these kinds of principles and ways of working and doing things. Carolyn, what are some simple strategies for embedding equity principles into succession planning? I feel like you might have already answered this question, so I wonder if I should ask you that or ask you the next one. What do you think? Because you've spoken a lot about equity. You've spoken about, you know, the you know, education, Auslan, like captioning, etc. But do you want an ableism?
I think, Lena, what it really comes down to is about prioritizing and making sure that you stick to your guns. So I think we can very easily, as Chloe, just to your point before about when you said maybe we shouldn't be thinking, or maybe it's not an organization's job to be thinking about all these other things, but why isn't it? Like, it should be our job actually to, and so it makes me think about and feel really proud of AAV, our level of flexibility around what people need. And so when we think about succession planning, we think about time, and we think about, as you acknowledged, like we think about capacity. So I'll leave my role next July, but we already know that there will be a 3-month handover before I leave. So when the new person gets appointed, that'll be announced in April, and then there will be a 3-month handover before I actually leave the role. And that feels really important. And it was when I took over from Veronica, we had a 9-month handover. And that, in a way, was amazing and hugely generous, but also became quite tricky because Veronica would come back always, at least 1 day a week was in the office. And what it became quite confusing or tricky for staff to think about who am I reporting to, or who can I go to, and because Veronica was so familiar and I was so unfamiliar to them. So it was quite tricky, which is why we decided this time to shorten that period. But what we do know is that for anyone to really succeed, but also for lots of disabled applicants or disabled leaders, we need to give people the best shot at it. And if that means giving people additional support to make that transition, then that's absolutely what we need to be doing. So yeah, I think it's about time, and I think it's about ensuring that equity is the absolute driver of that succession plan, and that we give time and energy and care to that process that can be completely molded around what that person needs in making that transition.
Thanks, Carolyn. I want to. We're going to very shortly watch a video, and I'm wondering if I can sneak this one question in, because we had a chat about it earlier in our pre-conversation about using recruitment agencies to help bring in new board members from disabled and First Nations backgrounds. Would either of you like to talk about this, about your experience of recruitment agencies? I know that First Nations led and run recruitment agencies are something that you mentioned, Chloe.
Yeah, but I do have a question, actually, if it's okay, to Caroline, if it's all right. Sorry, because just in you talking about that, what I love about that, I don't want to be one of those people that make statements when they say they've got questions. So I'll say this a little bit first. What I love about that is that you talked about it being structural, that the organisation had agreed to go, this is how we're doing this. My question is, how do we do that when, I work for a government organisation who I think it would be, there would be no way you would have a 3-month, but not a 9 month, but certainly not even a 3-month handover because of the way government works. So and this is a genuine question, like how do we do that? Because I think that's so critical and important to make it structural, to make it so this is what this org does to hand over. I mean, maybe it can only happen in other areas, I don't know, but I'm seeking the answers for myself because I really don't know, and I don't know how I'd be able to do that.
Yeah, that seems like we're hoping that there are people from government organisations listening to this. So I guess that's also a question about educating people who are responsible for hiring, isn't it? Like kind of asking those people to consider what is best practice if they are really committed to changing organisational cultures and having that diversity at the leadership level. So yeah, I think that's a really fair point. And when we're using those structures that are and working within those very colonial kind of structures and frameworks, and they haven't been really reflected on and I guess interrogated, or changes haven't been made, then that does make it really, hard for people like you in your roles to do the work that you do.
It also doesn't allow that change to happen in the way that we want it to. Like the only, and this is kind of, this is where the, and we don't necessarily need to get into this, but this is where kind of systemic and structural ableism exists, which we don't even recognize necessarily. So for us to really shift those systems, we need to be having these conversations, and we need to really be thinking about how can we change that so that it shifts. And that's a huge piece of work, and that's a massive cultural shift for organizations across the board and for government. Like it's really huge, but it is through being able to show examples, talk about why it happens. It's classic that people talk about really wanting change and really wanting equity, but actually when you put it into practice, it becomes really hard because we come up against these things that go, no, we can't possibly do that. And it's like, okay, well, we will stay within the status quo unless we can start to shift some of that thinking. And that is the challenge.
And on that note, maybe we can have a bit of a sign up for like a group of people in retirement, because that'll be my retirement project. Like, destabilizing the current systems. But that is all of our projects. That's like our life work. But I think that's so true. That's so true. I want to show this fantastic video that this is Gurkha Majaralu, who's the series producer, interviewing Fraser Caulfield, the artistic director of the Australian Theatre for Young People, or ATYP, and the video's been put together by Kevin Bathman. So over to you, Emerald, to show this video, which talks about governance structures in relation to ATYP's Youth Advisory Board.
Hello, my name's Fraser Caulfield. I'm the Artistic Director of the Australian Theatre for Young People, which is better known as ATYP, which works out of Sydney in partnership with organisations around the country. So this year, the ATYP Youth Advisory Board involves 60 young people aged between 13 and 26 from around the country. The Youth Advisory Board has 2 co-chairs, and they are elected and for 2-year terms on alternate years. So one person that is elected to the co-chair role learns from their predecessor, and then once they've had a year in the role, their predecessor leaves and a new person comes in and the mentoring continues. Those co-chair roles both facilitate the meetings, organise the agendas, liaise with the broader committee, but they also sit as observers on the ATYP board and learn from the ATYP board in terms of governance processes for the organisation, and also provide the opportunity for direct feedback from the Yabbies to the ATYP board. So part of the idea of the Youth Steering Committee is to ensure there are always 2 people who are leaders within the Youth Steering Committee who can then speak within the board and to the executive team and to others. The idea is that we are building, through this process of upskilling young people, a detailed understanding of the considerations that are going into the leadership of an organisation, from funding, from acquittals, from accountability, from contracting, from recruiting, to HR negotiations, to venue negotiations. So because the amount of information that has to be onboarded to understand what's involved in running an organisation like ATYP is immense, the idea is to give young people in particular a number of years of building that skills, and then creating opportunity for new people to come through and develop that opportunity. What we do find is that those young people then feed leadership either within the organisation. So we've had the past, like Tasnim Hussain, who is now at Melbourne Theatre Company. She was a young observer on our board, then she became a fully fledged board member. Now she's in a leadership role with Melbourne Theatre Company. So there's clear evidence that young people who are engaged and given the opportunity to develop this understanding then move into areas of responsibility within the sector.
Thank you so much, Fraser Caulfield. That was really good. And I like that, you know, kind of process of engaging young people, having those co-chairs, skilling people up, and seeing that the impacts of that over time, that people do then go on into leadership pathways. So Chloe, we've heard about how ATYP engages and skills up young people to become co-chairs and decision makers and observers. In your experience, and how can we formally identify and support people that want to participate in and be in leadership roles? And what are some of the initiatives or projects that you've seen that really work? Approaches, I should say.
I feel like this is both Caroline and I kind
Okay,
of
both
thing,
of you.
because I know when we sort of had a pre-chat, Caroline was talking, you were talking about, what was it called? The executive, no, what was it? Like it was an associate board membership thing.
The observership program.
That's it. Yeah. And I hadn't actually kind of heard about that. There'd been some things that we'd done to kind of bring particularly younger people into boards, but I'd never actually heard of that. And because maybe I'll speak to because there's very little we do in terms of First Nations stuff more formally. So I kind of want to hear about that one a bit more before speaking to that, if that's okay, Lena.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, there were a few points that we had put down, and we talked about a bit about the eldership when talking about succession planning, which I think you've touched on as well. And you're right, we talked about the observership program and also the Disability Leadership Institute. So Carolyn, should I throw to you to talk a little bit about the observership program and your experiences of it? And
Yeah, sure. So a few years ago, we were approached by Creator Victoria to ask us whether or not we would like to have an observer join our board. And the observers essentially come as very highly skilled people, mostly from corporate organizations, big corporates. And so the way it works is that each October, November time, we give our skills matrix, or we give a list of skills that we're looking for our board to Catherine, the amazing Catherine Reiser, who coordinates the observership program. And Catherine then, from the hundreds of potential observers that they have contact with, sends us a selection. The chair and I generally interview those people, and basically I just say, why do you want to be on this board? Why are you interested in us? And we then make a selection, and then we invite that person to join our board for a year. And they come, they don't have voting rights, but they are there essentially to learn governance skills. And because they're often coming from corporates, they are really looking to gain kind of governance knowledge, I suppose, from lots of not-for-profit organizations. In the last couple of years, the observership program has taken on a real focus on the recruitment of more diverse observers, because they realized and recognized that that's what all of the organizations were looking for. They were looking for more diverse observers to be able to come onto their boards, because that's what we were lacking. And so their target, the thing that I know most about is that they have been targeting deaf and disabled communities. Well, workers within those kind of corporates. to be part of the observership program. So it's been an amazing program to be part of. We have invited every one of our observers to join our board because they had skills that we needed, and so we've invited them to stay on and become fully fledged board members, and that has been incredible for our board in terms of enriching the skills for us. Yeah, so that's the observership program.
Do they have First Nations people that apply to be part of that program? Do you know?
That's a really good question, Chloe, and I think they probably have a handful, but they definitely don't have as many as there is a demand for.
Yeah. Because that's what I find to be a problem, is that we do we definitely have First Nations recruitment agencies, but it's recruitment for employment predominantly, not for boards. Occasionally it's for boards, but not particularly. It's for employment. There's one called Pipeline Talent who I've worked with. I'm not privileging Pipeline over anyone else. It's just one I've worked with quite a lot, and they're fantastic. But there are many, actually. There's many, and they're all First Nations led, run, First Nations board, etc. And that works really well. But in terms of board sort of planning, you know, I'll give you an example. NABA's always had First Nations people on their board. We currently have 3 First Nations people on the NABA board, which is pretty bloody good. There's a young person that's on the board, a young First Nations curator from Queensland who's recently come on, who the reason why I knew about her was because when we were at a particular big First Nations event called Parumpa, which was obviously done with, you know, in conjunction with Creative Australia, we were in a weaving session together, and we were yarning about boards and training, and she said, I really have been wanting to be on a board, but I don't seem to know how to get on one, and I want that training, and I went, well, I've got something for you. But it was because we were literally sitting down doing that weaving thing together, and it was through no other formal or structural kind of process. And I find that happens a lot. And so my, I guess, frustration and my questions about that observership program is, how do we make it structural so that First Nations people feel like, A, they know what a board is, they know what a board does, they feel comfortable coming into that space, because it's a pretty intimidating space at times. There is a perception that, and rightly so, that if you're on a board, you will be responsible for, you know, financial management and you know, all of that sort of thing, which is quite, it's not necessarily a skill set that all First Nations people, just because you were talking about, Caroline, about, oh, I'll just grab you, you're a person with a disability, I'll just grab you. Not all First Nations people on the street will have that sort of level of understanding about the financial implications of being a board member. So you can't just grab anyone. So yeah, I have found it quite difficult to get those people onto boards, and I don't really have any answers about that, except that, you know, we need to do more work in that area. We need to look at sort of the structural thing around, and maybe that what was it called? Emerald, you put it in the chat, but observership, maybe it's worthwhile sort of approaching them to see how we can help support that.
That would be amazing, Chloe, and that Catherine would be so up for that conversation. The great thing about the observership program too is that alongside them coming to board members and to board meetings and being part of the governance, ongoing governance of the organisation, they're also being trained up in governance skills. So it's like there's a governance training program that sits alongside the practicality of them coming to board meetings, and that's so amazing. It's not just up to us to teach them governance skills, but actually they're also gaining knowledge around the legislation and how to manage a budget and all those sorts of things, or what should they be looking for, risk management, all those things.
Yeah, because it's such a specific skill set.
Yeah.
the Australia Council has been running kind of governance programs over several years as well that are worth kind of looking at, and I know that recently they were I think partly covering the costs of, or they have a partnership with AICD, the Australian Institute of I'm not going to remember what it stands for, but they're
company directors.
Thank you, company directors focused on governance, and so they were giving, you know, I think partial or full scholarships to kind of attend courses to give people the skills that they need to be in roles where they have to enact governance. And as you mentioned, Chloe, there are organisations like Pipeline Talent Recruitment, which is a First Nations recruitment organisation, and there are others as well. I guess I don't know, you know, firsthand about all of these different ones, but I would definitely be encouraging people to use Indigenous owned and managed recruitment agencies as well as a way of connecting with First Nations potential board members and people in leadership roles as well. Because yeah, I think that we are having such a good conversation that we are not going to get to answer or ask all the questions, but I do want to ask, I want to go to that question about what we talked about previously, because I don't want to miss it, and it's just gone out of my brain now.
Lena, is it okay too if I just make a comment about the board thing?
Yes.
Just for people to bear in mind that it is mostly the same people who have, I mean, particularly in the arts, but probably everywhere, who have a bit of a national or a state profile, who will be asked to be on boards. So just people bear in mind that the First Nations person that you've asked to be on their board is probably on about 6 or 7 other boards, because they are the only person that people know of, and they have a skill set and people grab them to have them on there. So the need to do this kind of training and the need to succession plan is really, really urgent at the moment, because all of us, and I can speak for myself, I mean, I'm on multiple boards that weren't listed in my bio at the top, because I firmly believe it's necessary, but I'm also really tired, and there's sort of not enough of us to you know, to be drawn into that work. So it really, and that's not our responsibility as First Nations people, that's everyone else's to kind of solve that problem, not just ours.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think I remember the question that I wanted to ask, which was the question that the thing that you've both mentioned a few times about when you're invited onto a board to be that person, from a migrant background, a young person from a First Nations background, from a disabled background. How do you ensure that when you bring people on into your organisation, that they can really fully participate and bring their whole selves and all of their knowledge, and not have to be that person who has to talk only about and talk to and represent somehow all of the historically marginalised communities that they might come from, be connected to? How do we do that? And who would like to answer that very big question? And while we're doing that, Emerald has been popping in some of the links, like to the AICD, and we'll pop a link into the governance program at the Australia Council as well. And she's also popped a link into the observership program. So I'm just letting you know, so that people listening can use those links and find out more. So who would like to answer that very hard question that you could probably write a few PhDs on?
Just before I answer that question, can I just drop one more link into the box for people? And that is the Disability Leadership Institute. So trying to find disabled leaders, there are hundreds of disabled leaders that are out there ready to go, and we've been training them up for years and years and years. And what is needed is now a space to practice that. But for some reason, we seem to be quite elusive. Anyway,
No, that's so important, because can I say Media Diversity Australia, one of our key partners, also has a database of leaders, spokespeople from First Nations backgrounds, culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, or culturally and racially marginalised, and I believe of disabled people as well, and really there's a lot of crossover media arts. So I actually think that's gold dust, Carolyn, like talking about the media talking about disability leaders as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Disability Leadership Institute. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's run by Christina Ryan, who so it's a completely disability-led organisation, and Christina's whole role is there is a network of disabled leaders. So I know there's lots of us. So along with kind of creating networks for us to support each other, Christina also does a lot of incredible coaching with organisations around bringing disabled leaders in to organisations to skill them up to be ready, to create culturally safe environments, and also can support with recruitment of disabled leaders into those roles. Because I love knowing, Chloe, that pipeline exists, because we don't have anything like that other than Disability Leadership Institute in place for disabled leaders. So yeah, connect with them if this is something you're interested in. They can also help with board recruitment.
Yeah, I mean, I feel bad privileging Pipeline as if like I somehow work for them and are paid to promote them. It's not that at all. It's just I have worked with them before and I know they're fantastic. But we do actually have quite a few, which is really great. But I do, you know, the thing that comes to mind for me is that we all get a bit lazy, in the sense that when we're asked to do these things, we go, oh yeah, I know a person, bang, without going to what is readily available clearly and other resources, and kind of doing the work a bit more. So I think that's on all of us, just as much as everyone else, to put in that work, to actually explore some of these avenues.
And can I say that kind of aligned to what you're both talking about, Cecily Smith-Stovell, who many of you might know, who's just a brilliant theatre maker and equity educator, said that Westpac also has a board placement program, which her not-for-profit is participating in. And she does say, though, that there don't seem to be measures for cultural safety of the observers that I've seen or experienced from any of the programs I've participated in. I don't know if you have any comments on that one. I might keep going, but I think that the Westpac placement program, thank you, Cecily, for that. And this is the bit where I say it is actually, sorry, time to show the second, almost time to show the second video, but I'm going to, I do a terrible thing of getting really lost in the conversation and really enjoying it and then forgetting about to actually ask the questions. But I feel like we've covered so much that we've actually covered all of those well thought out questions that we developed in the session that we had prior to this to work them out. Can we now go to that second video, which is a case study from Corrugated Iron Youth Arts? And then we can either come back to some of our questions, Chloe and Carolyn. We can look at the online questions, or we can look at the online questions and answer those. But I think we'll move now to that next case study.
Hi, my name is Zoe Scroggins. I'm the executive producer and CEO at Corrugated Iron Youth Arts. Corrugated Iron Youth Arts is the leading youth arts company in the Northern Territory, and we play a really crucial role in a region where there is no major performing arts company or tertiary training in the arts. So one of the mechanisms that we have in place at Corrugated Iron is a group called our Young Champions, and they're from the ages of 12 to 18, and they play a really crucial role in in ensuring that we're steering the ship in the right direction. And they interact with our board, who are obviously over 18. So this plays an important role for young people to really influence the decision making in the organisation in a way that's youth friendly and a way that's accessible to them.
I'm Matilda. I've been a champion at Corrugated Iron for about 2 years, but I've been participating at Coro for 11 years this year. We do fundraising for Coro. We did just this year we did a phone three-a-thon where we spent 6 hours in a room without our phones to raise money for Coro. We talked to the board about ways we want to improve Coro. We had a meeting earlier this year to have input into Coro's strategic plan. And we decide at the start of each year, like if there's any new classes we'd like Coro to offer and stuff like that.
Corrugated Iron really values succession planning across all aspects of the organisation. So engaging with young champions, it offers them a way to have different accessible points to enter into the organisation, whether that be as a participant, or the next step could be to be employed within the organisation as a teaching artist. So, for example, our general manager at the moment, she started as a young participant and then went away, did her study, and then came back to Darwin and worked in other arts organisations. But part of her goals was to be an arts leader, and so we welcomed her in as the general manager, and she's been here for a couple of years now.
But just being with the champions and like spending time every month, like talking about how we think we can make Coro better has just really helped my confidence. Before I was champion, I just went to Coro and I went to my circus class and I never really saw what happened behind the scenes. But now I meet the members of the board and I know like what Zoe does with her job in her office all day. And I've been there while Coro's thinking about what they're doing for the next 2-3 years. So it's definitely put into perspective like how much work goes on behind the scenes for all the great stuff we do.
Thank you so much for that, Corrugated Iron. And who here wants to do the phone-a-thon? Like we'll lock ourselves in a room. I'd like to do that with my kids. I don't know the kind of stress it might cause, but that's fantastic. And seeing so many people going on to actually be those young people going in and being empowered and going into those leadership roles is, I think, really great practice and really good example. So Carolyn and Chloe, I do have one question that I'd like to ask that I feel it seems to be that in recent years we've seen a lot of good leaders who've come from historically marginalised backgrounds into leadership roles, who might not have necessarily come from the arts sector, but who get either burned out very, very quickly or just don't stay. And retention seems to be a key issue. And I'm wondering what strategies we can use to retain good leaders and, you know, to ensure that sustainability for organisations, and how can we mitigate those risks? So what that comment that Cecily made in the Q&A about not seeing that cultural safety being a part of those programs to encourage diverse leadership.
Carolyn, do you want to go first, or do you want me, or we can both? I'll go first. And apologies, I'm feeding my dogs treats to keep them quiet during the webinar. So, they're just being so naughty, of course, because mum's distracted. I think part of a really fundamental kind of principle in keeping people, or attracting First Nations people and keeping them in roles, is to assume that they are coming from a position of great talent, knowledge, ability, professionalism. I know that seems like a weird thing to say, but so often, and certainly through my career until I got to a certain point, people were coming at me with it from an expectation of I had all these struggles to overcome, and a real deficit model, like, and I needed more education, and I needed this and I needed that, and they can help me. In fact, we should come in with the assumption that First Nations mob in this country, whilst participating in what might look like a different kind of leadership model culturally, are in fact some of the most incredible cultural leaders in the country. And the reason they are is because they have to code switch, and they have to do the job of multiple people all at once. They have to understand, what a white culture, or non-Indigenous, non-First Nations culture, as well as their own culture, and learn how to knit the two and come out with effective solutions, pathways, and methods of action for both. So that's my first point, I guess, is like really proceed with that kind of assumption in place that values First Nations leadership, however that looks, and assume that those people are incredible individuals that can do these jobs. You'd be surprised how often that is not the assumption. I would imagine there is a similar thing for you, Caroline, and for the disability sector.
Yeah, absolutely, Chloe. So similar. And I have a theory that I expect greatness of everyone, and we have incredible retention rates at AAB, and lots of people think that that's because people might not get a job somewhere else, so they stay with us. But actually, I like to think that they stay with us not only because they feel valued and valuable within our organisation, but also because we have established an incredible enterprise agreement, and we're an amazing organisation to work for, and we have a flexibility built in that allows people to be their full selves, and we don't ask anyone to leave anything at the door. And I think that becomes very attractive to people. We're an arts organisation where they don't have to kind of come in contact with ableist attitudes on a daily basis. Like that, it's a very safe environment that we're creating. And I think a big part of our work is trying to work with other arts organisations to think through or to share what we do and how they can take that on as well. Yeah.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes left. If it's okay, Emerald, I know it's a bit early, but if you could pop in for anyone who needs to leave early, the link to the survey. So we do a survey for each session because we're constantly wanting to get your feedback and share that feedback with the speakers and also, improve. So please complete it if you can. It's very quick. And then I might go to one of the questions if we have some time. It's a really fun and big question by Alex Marsden, which says, a good discussion about improving the status quo, but do we, for example, still need boards? What are your thoughts on more structural changes to governance and expectations so we can deal with the enormous challenges the world is facing today? Now, that is just a nice small question to answer in a minute. Sorry, I should stop using bad dad humour.
I just wanted to introduce the work of Kate Larson. Kate's been doing a load of work and is doing a whole piece of work at the moment around governance structures and what we actually need within the arts sector, but also just organisationally. And that is really demonstrating some really fascinating outcomes from that. So I'm not sure if Kate's been publishing that information yet, but I would kind of watch this space for what might emerge, because I think there's some really it's going to lead some interesting conversations.
And she actually was one of the speakers for the first governance conversation. So Alex, you can go back and listen to Kate, and she did share resources and some of the work that she's been doing at looking at alternative governance structures or alternative structures. I'm personally like a strong believer in having some kinds of structures because we're accountable to community, and I think we need to have that transparency and that accountability. But unfortunately, quite often those structures that are designed to make sure that things are fair and transparent are locking out many people. So there are different ways that we need to approach things.
Yeah, and they are boards under capitalism, basically. So boards that are always about risk management and about, money. But, First Nations mob have always had boards. We just don't call them boards. They're elders circles. It's a whole different way of thinking about it, which is really, exactly as you said, Lena, about your responsibilities to community to ensure that everyone, gets fed and looks after children and has access to certain things and is educated, and there is intergenerational transmission of knowledge and all of those things. So we've always had that. So for me, a board, that idea is a fairly normal sort of idea, but a board under capitalism, a board which is set up, as we mostly are, to provide a governance structure and a risk management structure. I feel like they're always going to exist, but do they need to exist? Well, maybe not, but maybe not in the way that we currently think about them, in essence.
Yeah, I agree. I think both of you have great responses to that, and thanks for that question, and sorry that we can't get to all of those questions now, but I did want to encourage you please to visit the Creative Equity Toolkit and creativeequitytoolkit.org, and there are two main topic areas. One is organisational culture, one is governance. And there are fantastic kind of practical actions, lots of articles, worksheets about succession planning, and that a toolkit was developed by Diversity Arts Australia and the British Council, and we also partnered with Garawa, who have very much informed and reviewed and provided a lot of input into that toolkit. I know it's time to go. Please fill in the survey. I wanted to really close the session by thanking our incredible speakers, Clothilde Bullen and Carolyn Bowditch, for sharing such deep knowledge and experience for this session, and really love those last comments about that strengths-based model and not seeing people as coming in without knowledge just because they don't fit a particular way that we are taught to view things. And I wanted to thank Creative Australia for leading this project, and particularly Adelaide Reef, Emerald Dunn Frost and Adam McGowan, and the wonderful team at Diversity Arts Australia. A massive thank you and acknowledgement to our series producer, Dr. Görkem Ajaralu, who's in Turkey working on a project at the moment. Thank you to our Auslan interpreters and our live captioners. And importantly, thank you to all of you for joining and for participating in this conversation today.
Thank you so much for having us, Caroline. Absolute pleasure. Love being able to speak to you.
And you, Chloe. Thanks, Lena, for hosting.
Thank you.
Thank you.